Hi, I'm Tony Russo, and in this bonus episode of Funeral Service Insider, the podcast, we speak with Tyler Anderson, the Vice President of Business Development for Precoa. He's going to be giving a talk at our upcoming Funeral Service Business Plan in Pittsburgh on April 1st. We're going to talk a little bit about his presentation, and we're going to get offline, as I tend to do, about ways funeral directors can reimagine the entire process that goes beyond pre-need. But he's the expert. I'm just here to listen. So here's Tyler. So I am looking forward to seeing you in Pittsburgh in the coming weeks. Can you talk to me a little bit about what you hope to present and what you hope people will take away from your presentation?
Oh, absolutely. I'm looking forward to being in Pittsburgh, looking forward to seeing everyone. And the focus of the presentation is really around winning more families in an ever-changing market. I think if you talk to any funeral home owner today, they would say that the families they serve today are rapidly changing. Their preferences, their wishes, their needs, their desires, those are all rapidly changing. And actually, a recent study by Accenture stated that 88% of executives across all industry say consumers are changing faster than their businesses can keep up, which in our opinion makes it even more important than ever for a funeral home to stay relevant. And we think a robust pre-need strategy can be a significant contributor to staying relevant to the ever-changing consumer.
Does it have to do a lot with touches? I'm thinking that there are increasingly the branding strategy is to just say the name, to just, the details can kind of start to fade backwards as long as the name is present. Does that sound right? Am I way off there?
Well, I think there's, the general marketing principle of the number of times the message has to land or has to be kind of distributed or put in front of the average consumer before it lands. That certainly applies in pre-need or general brand awareness marketing within the funeral space. I think what we would point to is that the messaging itself needs to change, and the channels in which it's delivered. Obviously, every consumer doesn't live online 100% of the time, and they certainly aren't reachable offline 100% of the time. And that's where our advocacy for an omni-channel approach really comes into play. Because if you're trying to serve a diverse market within your community, meaning these individuals are online, they are offline, and the messages that we used to deliver to them to create action are no longer as effective, we not only have to look at the channels, we have to look at the messaging. For example, we used to really lean on this messaging. One small example, this messaging around, Tony, did you know within 24 hours of a loss, you have to make 125 decisions?
Yes, I've heard that before.
Yeah, and it's true. So there's nothing wrong with that messaging. At the same time, when you look at the consumer we're trying to reach today and the age demographic we would define as a pre-need prospect, that message doesn't resonate. It actually just is overwhelming and creates anxiety and is a barrier to taking action. So
go ahead, please.
No, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say it's not even just so much cutting through the noise as it is saying something that is more positive, that makes people not want to. No one needs an invitation anymore to go in their basement and stay there forever.
No, that's very true, especially post-COVID. But
Right.
I think when you actually, some of the things that we look at that are contributing to this need and shifting the messaging is ceremony, ritual, and gathering around a loss were historically defined by religious institutions. And the majority of adults in America belong to, associated with, or identified with one of those religious institutions. When my grandfather was a funeral home owner in the 40s and 50s, he knew pretty quickly it's a Protestant funeral, a Catholic funeral, a Lutheran funeral. This is what it's going to look like.
Right.
Today's world, 29% of U.S. adults today identify as a religious none, which a religious none is defined as individuals who do not find religious institutions to have a meaningful impact on their day-to-day life. If you look at individuals 18 to 49, you kind of narrow the window, it's 40%. That
Wow.
would be the largest religion in America today if it was a religion. And so this idea, this embedded institutional value of ceremony, ritual, and gathering, like we knew what a funeral meant,
Mm,
no longer really exists in the same way it used to. I've had people in my hometown where I grew up, and again, my family owned and operated funeral homes, and they would tell me, I don't want a funeral. But then they would go on to describe what they do want, which was a gathering at a local park with their favorite keg of beer, their favorite food, and telling stories. And I'm like,
right.
that's actually a funeral. As a profession, we have just done a poor job communicating and articulating what a funeral can look like to today's consumer and how the funeral home can help facilitate that and the role the funeral home can play in it. And that's where we think Preneed plays such a key role because we can have those conversations 10, 15, 20 years in advance to inform and educate families to the role the funeral home does play in facilitating those services, where we're not waiting until the day of a loss to try to share that story.
And because on the other side of it, it just occurs to me that one of the things that I've editorialized a lot about is this need to be more open to the idea of celebrations of life. And funeral directors and funeral homes increasingly are, as long as you ask them, right? If if you ask them, they'll do anything, but they're waiting for you to ask them. And that's also part of the messaging, I guess, that needs to change.
I think it can, and I think it should. And to your point, and having a more proactive approach to articulating what ceremony, ritual, and gathering could look like, and the diversity of what it looks like is really critical because there's a lot of preconceived notions, and most of the preconceived notions around what a funeral is only based on our personal experience of what we've attended in the past. And if you think about it, hopefully you don't have a ton of funeral experience,
Right.
but you probably have some personal loss experiences, whether it was depend on your age, whether it was a parent or a grandparent. Most of us think back to the funeral we attended for our grandparents, and that service isn't necessarily relevant to us and didn't really speak to us, and therefore we default to, I don't want a funeral because we
Right.
think that's what a funeral is. But as a profession, as a funeral home, it's upon us to communicate to the consumer that a funeral is really whatever you want it to be. There's some core elements to that in terms of ceremony, ritual, and gathering, and but what that looks like is very different. It's probably an overused analogy or parallel, but if you think about the wedding industry
Right.
and if you picked up a wedding album from 30 years ago, I'll just ask you, Tony, like and you look at the wedding, the photo album, where were the pictures taken?
They were taken into church. Yeah.
And then who was often the individual that married them?
The priest was the one that married them.
Right. And if you look at a wedding album today, where are the pictures?
Yeah, no, my wife and I do wedding photography on the side. I haven't
Oh,
spoken with a priest in 3 years. Who knows? It's
so
very
yeah,
rare.
so you're very in tune to this. So the point is, it's usually a friend or close family member that is marrying the couple because that's personal and relevant to them. They're having the ceremony or where they have the pictures, on a beach, in a rustic barn, on a farm, whatever the venue is. And so they didn't abandon ceremony, ritual, and gathering. It just looks very different than what it did 30 years ago. So when you think about the fundamentals of what a wedding is, those still exist, but they look very different because it's in different venue, it's different individuals participating. And I think that I'm not trying to say a funeral is a wedding, but what I am saying is that if we can better communicate sooner to the ever-changing consumer that a funeral can also look different than what they maybe previously experienced that didn't speak to them, I think we have a higher likelihood of individuals across the country placing value in the services funeral homes provide.
Yeah, and to kind of echo what you had said earlier, we're also more likely to have been to a wedding recently. We've seen weddings change faster than we've seen funerals change because that's something that you're more likely to go to a wedding. You're more people are invited to a wedding, I guess.
Well,
Um,
I think that's true. I also think the wedding industry has done a really great job of
uh,
communicating the value of service and what what ceremony I don't want to be redundant in these words, but what ceremony,
Yeah.
ritual, and gathering can look like, because I know a number of young individuals that are not even in a relationship, but they can tell you what their wedding's going to look like.
Yes.
And I think that's indicative of an industry that has a consistent message to the consumer as to the value in ceremony around this milestone event.
Right. And the idea of, I guess there are people who are, I've been doing this for too long, so I'm very interested in my, in my legacy and what's going to happen at my funeral or whatever. But I guess it's harder to admit that you're going to die than it is to hope that you're going to get married.
I think that's a fair point. That's why I always hesitate to say,
Yeah.
admitting a funeral is the exact
Yeah.
same as
Yeah.
a wedding. But if you think about the elements of it, you have friends and family who are impacted by the event. It's a milestone within anyone's life. It's a marker. Life looks different after this event.
Yes.
And historically, the ritual and the ceremony around it was heavily influenced or even dictated by religious institutions.
And now the hope is that people, I guess what I was getting at was will have permission to visualize what their funeral could be. Knowing that you don't have to take what you're given is an opportunity.
Yes, and I think having, when you think about the prearrangement experience and the conversation we have with a family in a prearrangement experience, I think another shift in messaging, it both comes through in marketing and also comes in the conversation that we're having with a family.
Yeah.
Is we used to historically say, Tony, the value in planning this in advance is you get to plan the funeral you want. And more times than not, that's today is more off-putting because you say, I'm not gonna be there. I don't know.
Literally what my mother said.
And if you ask my father, who owned and operated a funeral home for 40 plus years, what does he want for his funeral? The first thing he's going to say is, don't make a fuss.
Right.
And he spent 40 years, counseling,
Making a fuss.
and guiding and stewarding people through the value of ceremony at the time they lost a loved one. So what we would submit is, in a prearrangement experience, having the value proposition shifted from you get to plan the funeral you want to you get to plan the funeral your family will need. Because when you think about, if I ask my dad, what do you think my sister and I will need when you're gone? His answer is very different. And so that's a way to shift messaging within the actual interaction with the consumer. So we would submit that messaging isn't just as simple as saying our lead generation or our marketing messaging has to shift. We would submit that our conversation with the consumer also has to shift.
Excellent. Well, that will do it for now. And we will check in with you next time. We'll have more of this in Pittsburgh in April, but we'll also have you on again soon. So thank you so much for your time.
Absolutely. Thank you, Tony.
Once again, we hope you will join us on April 1st in Pittsburgh at the Sheraton Pittsburgh Hotel at Station Square. All of the information for registration and hotels and stuff like that is on the website. There is a link in the show notes. This bonus episode is a Kates-Boylston production. It was written and edited by me, Tony Russo. Please subscribe wherever you're listening now. Follow if you're on Apple. If you're watching or watching on YouTube, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel. That will do us for this time, and I will catch you Friday with In Case You Missed It.